So thanks so much to everyone for joining us today. I sincerely appreciate it. And I guess I should say good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on from where you're coming. But the U.S. national parks have always been such important destinations for group tours and package travel. And as interest in outdoor activity has grown exponentially, so has the desire to visit these national parks. So those of you on this webinar, you're not only bringing U.S. Travelers to the parks, but I know you're also bringing visitors from countries outside the U.S. And before I welcome our speaker today, I want to give a shout out to Max Rosen, who is my primary contact for NTA's Washington consulting firm, which is Elevate Government Affairs. Max and I are in touch every day, sometimes multiple times a day, as we work together on your behalf, whether it's advocating for COVID relief or access to the national parks or just a myriad of other legislative challenges and opportunities that come our way. And as our world and specifically travel is reopening in phases, there understandably have been challenges and confusion on many levels, including with access to the highly in-demand parks. And to help find answers and solutions, NTA is a part of a 7-association coalition. And I'm really glad that several of my colleagues are with us here today. But we have worked closely together for the past 18 months on several issues, especially related to the U.S. national parks. And we've had success through small groups of association leaders and tour operators coming together and working specifically with individual parks. And then also we've made progress through coalition meetings with MPS officials, including our speaker today. And we're just really appreciative of their willingness to continue to work with us and to provide helpful information, then also just to listen to our needs and concerns. So now I'm really happy to introduce Kurt Rausch, who is the Chief of Commercial Services Program with the National Park Service. And thank you, Kurt, so much for being here with us. And he's going to share the latest information on COVID restrictions, guidelines related to group travel, and information as much as he can on the CUAs as well. And we'll have time for your questions, which Kurt will take at the end of his comments. But please, throughout, you can post your questions in the Q&A feature. And then if you have resources that you want to share with your other attendees or even with us, or if you have resources, comments, put that in the chat feature. And then following his comments, if you want to ask a question live, you can use the raise hand feature and we'll unmute your microphone. So with that, Kurt, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thanks, Catherine. It's great to be here. And I share Catherine's comments regarding the coalition that have been put together and the ability to have ongoing dialogue with that group and individual operators occasionally as well. It's been really helpful as the Park Service has kind of worked through this several-year process of dealing with COVID, now in kind of our second big summer. And it's been really, really helpful to get insights as to what the issues are and be able to provide information on where the Park Service is going, what to expect, where to go for information. So we really appreciate the opportunity to have that kind of dialogue. And we also really appreciate all of you and the services that you provide to parks, bringing people to parks and guiding them through that park experience. We recognize that it's a valuable part of the way we get people to and through parks. And we are interested in making sure that process works as well as it can. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges associated with that related to managing over 500 park units that each have their own jurisdictions and requirements and how to manage that and what we do. Just a little bit more background on myself. So I've been with the Park Service now for about 13 years. Prior to that, I worked as a consultant for the Park Service for another 10. So I've been with the Park Service in one way or another for over 25 years. My portfolio is the Commercial Services Program, which includes concession contracts. So all of the lodging, food and beverage, retail operators, red bus tours, all of the folks that you see when you're out in parks that are providing commercial visitor services directly in the parks through a concession contract or within our portfolio, as well as leases. We have a kind of an emerging set of leases, which are facilities that the parks have determined to be access to their needs, but could provide some appropriate use within a park and as offsets for maintaining those facilities. Then finally, commercial use authorizations, which are those authorizations that many of you may have, that allow guides and outfitters, bus operators, and other small operators, that some beginning and ending in the park, some coming from outside the park, to operate under a permit requirement, which is something that technically all commercial operators in parks are supposed to have. So that's my portfolio. So I got a number of questions from Catherine and from Max prior to this call that talked, as Catherine suggested, to where are we on COVID, and how is the Park Service responding? What does that look like for you as road-based commercial tour operators and guides coming into parks? How is that going to change over time? What do we see in the future in terms of how that might be managed? And then a couple specific questions. So I'm just going to start by talking a little bit more about what we expect for what's happening now in parks and what we anticipate over the next year or so. So we are really seeing record visitation already, and we're not into the height of the summer season yet. So we recognize that people have pent-up demand and are very anxious to get out to parks, and they were not able to do that in the past. And so in almost all the parks, irrespective of whether they're small pocket parks or they're the large parks like Yellowstone or Zion or Bryce Canyon, we are seeing incredible visitation through the roof. We are happy that we're seeing a slowdown in COVID. That's allowing that to occur as people get vaccinated, which we strongly encourage, as well as the practices that CDC has put in place to allow us to travel more safely than before. But we're also a little concerned and have our eye on the ball of the Delta variant that is occurring. I don't know if you all know, but the Park Service has one of the oldest interagency relationships in the federal government, and that relationship is with the Office of Public Health. They wear blue uniforms and look like Navy officers, and we have a number of those cast about the Park Service, and then a core team that works in the Washington office that supports all our programs. And so we're working very closely with them, and they're informing us of how things are going relative to COVID spread, and they are concerned about the Delta variant. So while we see things opening up and we're really encouraged by that, we're always being cautious and making sure that we have a backup plan if things go wrong. We have seen a few, even this summer, COVID cases of both concessioners and Park Service employees. So we know that it's not completely gone, and there are needs for us to be safe as we do that. As all of this is occurring, we're seeing, and hopefully you're seeing from us, a kind of a evolution of how we're managing in parks. And so while we started back in 2020 with some pretty significant restrictions, many of those dictated by state and local requirements, those have slowly lifted. And as those lift, and as CDC starts to lift their requirements, we're trying to respond as fast as we can. And having conversations with some of the team that helps do this in the Washington office just the other day, we all joke that tomorrow is the day before the 4th of July weekend, and we predict, and I'm kidding here a little bit, that by 5 o'clock in the afternoon tomorrow, there'll be some new notice by CDC on loosening some of the restrictions, and we'll be spending Saturday trying to get everybody ready so they can apply those changes on the 4th of July. And that's kind of characteristic of what we've been doing, is a lot of which is seeing the change over time and then working to get guidance out to the parks so that they can apply that in a conscientious and quick manner, so that we can make sure that the visitors are having the experience they're expecting, but are still being safe. So where we're going right now, we've got record visitation, but we're also significantly constrained because early in this year and through last year, we had significant limitations. And some of the limitations were in our ability to bring staff people on to support the parks during the 2021 season. Many of our concessioners hire from outside the country or from within the country, but there were still restrictions on how people could travel and their ability to be in parks. The same is true of our park staff. And so we bring a lot of seasonal staff on. We start that hiring process way back in January. And in January, we still didn't really know where we were going to be. We'd hoped that we'd be in a position that we are now where things are loosening up and we've got plenty of people coming to parks, but we didn't know. And there were limitations on what we could do. One of the primary limitations is housing, because the concession staff, as well as the Park Service staff that come to the park, have to live in housing that is typically located within the park. And in many cases, that housing was dormitory style housing where we had upwards of 4 people living in a single room. And if you remember back, and sometimes it's difficult even now as we have seen a lot of opportunity to travel more, several months ago, there was still significant concern. There was not a lot of vaccinations that were occurring yet. And we had to constrain the number of people that we could bring into train or plan to bring into parks, and it takes a long time. And so what we're seeing in parks now is lots of visitation, but insufficient staff on both the concession side and the Park Service staff to manage as effectively as we would like to, given those number of people. And so we're dealing with that challenge, and in some cases that challenge backs up against things like long lines in restaurants or the inability for us to entertain, for some concessionaires, for example, to be able to take group reservations yet. We're hoping that it seems like we are moving in a really good direction despite some of these variants that might be occurring. And we're hoping by 2022 that we'll have this all in the rearview mirror. We'll have learned, of course, from that exercise, and that some of the collaboration that we've had with folks such as yourselves will be able to carry forward as we get back to kind of regular order business, and we can start to do the things that we like to do on a more regular basis. So that's kind of where we are on a macro scale about what's happening within the Park Service and where we'd like to go. I did want to spend a couple of minutes talking about COVID restrictions and kind of understanding why they might vary from park to park, how they were developed, and where we kind of stand on those in terms specifically in reference to transportation systems. So there has, of course, been a continuous evolution. If you kind of refer back even 6 months ago, there were many parks were still closed. There were lots of limitations on requirements. A lot of that is driven by state and local requirements. And this is a kind of a nuanced point that Catherine mentioned at the entry remarks. That is that our parks have various jurisdictional requirements. So we are federal enclaves in a particular location, but parks are established and by statute are granted a certain type of authority. Some of the oldest parks have what's called exclusive jurisdictional authority. And that means that the federal requirements are the only requirements in the park, and whatever the overlay of federal requirements plus whatever specific requirements might be implemented by the superintendent are those that are preeminent for that particular park. Those are relatively rare, in fact. The vast majority of parks are what we call proprietary or concurrent jurisdiction. And in those parks, there's a relationship between the authorities, whether they be local or state, and those requirements apply within the park. And it varies, and it's a complicated kind of patchwork of exactly how that works. So if you're traveling from one park, say Yellowstone National Park, which has exclusive jurisdiction because of its long time being there, to a smaller park, say Big Hole National Battlefield in Idaho, you might find that the one is still applying, say, Idaho requirements, whereas the other has federal requirements that apply. The last nuance to that is even in circumstances where there's an exclusive jurisdiction, our parks are very deferential to state and local requirements, and particularly in situations like COVID, where the impact of what might be happening in the park ultimately translates out to the local community. So if we had, for example, a lot of COVID-19 or a large COVID-19 outbreak, the park doesn't have the capacity to manage the medical requirements of that community. Those would be all transported out to the local community. And so it becomes important for us to be engaged in addressing what the local community needs are relative to public health issues. Of course, the same is also true in that the locality is providing staff and other materials and support into the park, And so we want to be respectful of them for that purpose as well. So even though that we may have an exclusive jurisdiction park where the state and local requirements might not absolutely apply, in many cases, particularly last year and then moving into the early part of this year, we adopted those requirements and we're very deferential to letting those occur. I think a really good example of that some have probably experienced is Yosemite. In Yosemite National Park, there was a lot of attention paid to the state and also the local Mariposa County requirements, which were fairly rigorous relative to group size and mask wearing and other conditions that ultimately were applied within the park and limited the park's ability to do certain things because of that interest in respecting what were for that state and locality important requirements to manage public health. So that's kind of how it works jurisdictionally. So we've got this overlay and patchwork that occurs, which particularly for folks such as yourself that are traveling from one jurisdiction to another can be really complicated to negotiate. Certainly if you're a commercial use operator and the only thing you're doing is providing guide and outfitting services to Grand Teton National Park, it's a much simpler thing than if you're driving from Kansas to Nebraska to Wyoming to Colorado, et cetera, and having to deal with all the differences in jurisdiction and then how those are being applied in a park. So we have a particular appreciation for that. The last thing I'll mention is that we also have the ability, superintendents have the authority to institute even more rigorous requirements if they feel there's a particular need. So in some cases that's reflected in decisions on limiting the number of people that might be in a particular area as relates to COVID, because even though there might not be, say, an outside limitation that the Park Service has set, that particular superintendent feels that due to the potential for people to gather there and for it to be an unsafe experience, as informed by our public health service colleagues, they may make a decision through what we call a superintendent's compendium that would authorize that specific requirement. So, so we've again got even a higher, greater level of complexity when we add in some of those superintendent requirements. So in regards to Park Service policy, in 2020, we were very deferential and there are quite a few state and local requirements that were driving a lot of the decision-making by the Park Service. Those have slowly lifted, and the Park Service in kind has lifted those with strong emphasis on reflecting what the CDC is asking us to do. So in terms of where we are now in relative to COVID and requirements for transportation systems, we've eliminated the mask wearing requirements for outside vehicles for those that are fully vaccinated. And that was something that came up back in May where the President of the United States notified everybody that people didn't have to wear masks if they weren't vaccinated. However, we are still respecting the CDC guideline that has come out and the same one that applies to airlines and others where there's an order from the CDC that says, at least on transportation systems to include buses, that masks will still be worn. There had been some restrictions on the number of people that could be close to each other. There was a 6-foot distancing requirement that we're applying in vehicles up until June. And at that point in time, the Park Service, with consultation from the U.S. Public Health Service, decided that there was sufficiently low enough risk so that the Park Service could relieve that requirement. So this requirement to have multiple seats empty on shuttle buses or even on buses coming into the park was lifted. And so now there's the same requirement as on an airplane where people can sit next to each other if they wish, but they all have to be masked up. The last piece is that early on, particularly before there was a lot of vaccinations that was occurring, we had put together guidance that talked to the particular things that bus companies could do to further limit risk. And so there was discussion about asking customers to quarantine in advance, to get screenings in advance so that they could be assured that when people came on the bus and then were traveling together for a long period of time, that would be a safe practice and there wouldn't be any issues that might emerge when they got to a particular park, for example, and the need to have medical attention applied or the potential for multiple people to get sick. Those were all shoulds, but not musts in terms of our policy that we've put together. We know that a lot of you have already implemented those. And as people are getting vaccinated, the need for that type of rigor in terms of screening in advance might not necessarily be necessary. And maybe instead you're asking people if they're vaccinated or not as a means to kind of control that. So that's kind of where we are now in terms of core policy. Core policy is that everybody's still required to wear a mask per the CDC order. We're no longer limiting the number of people based on a 6-foot social distancing. And then we have these other overlays in terms of coming, once you get off the bus, the need to wear masks if you're, or request that you wear a mask if you're not fully vaccinated, but fully vaccinated people not having that requirement. The last thing I'll mention is that even outside in indoor settings, the Park Service is still applying a 6-foot social distance requirement, and that's that continues to apply, but we are working to find ways to kind of moderate that as well. For example, we've requested a waiver from the Department of Interior to allow less than 6-foot social distance in certain circumstances. And they include spectator venues such as Wolf Trap National Park, if anybody's been there. Before we had segregated, or we had spacing between people, and we've asked to be able to do that at a closer density. Also historic homes where people were taking tours and it'd be very difficult to walk and maintain 6-foot social distancing. And we're hoping that those sorts of things are going to be able to allow visitors to come and be more comfortable and actually open some of the facilities we had not been able to do before. The last one is other tight spaces, some of which are back of the house and actually impact the concessionaire's ability to provide services. So many of you, if you're familiar with kitchens, particularly in the Park Service, they're small kitchens. It's very difficult to maintain 6 feet of distance. And by allowing a waiver, people are wearing masks or otherwise managing that situation, where we may be able to open more kitchens, which has been demonstrated to be one of the pinch points in terms of the concessionaire's ability to provide services to visitors. So we've got a lot of people in parks, a lot of people staying in housing, but long lines for food and beverage operations. This may help that somewhat. So, a great example of the collaboration that's occurred was the collaboration that I heard about from Yellowstone and Grand Canyon National Parks, 2 parks where we attempted to, we came together with a bunch of the parks and asked them to look to collaborate and find ways to create some commonality in terms of how they might approach things. And I think those 2 parks were a great example of that. Based on what I heard from the park, and I don't have a specific knowledge of every single park's requirements, but I did reach out to Yellowstone before this meeting. And as I understand it, they have no capacity limits on buses. Masks are required for all passengers per the CDC order. And that is really their basic requirements. There may be some other requirements regarding specific parking restrictions in certain places. That wasn't mentioned to me specifically. But what I also heard was that on transportation systems, particularly things like shuttles, despite the fact that there's mask wearing requirements, it's not always happening. And our rangers are asked to not strictly enforce that requirement just because of the difficulty in some cases to make that happen, but even though it is an absolute requirement. So things seem to be doing fairly well in that regard. I know, and I mentioned earlier that Grand Canyon also applied similar standards as far as I know. At Yosemite, I reached out there as well. And as I understand it, those are similar restrictions that we're seeing at Yosemite. They did have a whole series of restrictions that were based on a color coding system at the state, but since the state is fully open, those have all been relaxed. I do know that there are some restrictions in terms of bus size and where they can park and where they can drop visitors off. And I don't know all the details on all of those, but the park was able to kind of run through some of those specific requirements. And we do probably have in other parks restrictions on specific parking places that may be addressing concerns about overcrowding, as well as just restrictions that may be due to construction or other things that are happening this summer. So that seems to be where we are as a program right now in terms of COVID. Started pretty rigorous. Things have relaxed over time. We anticipate that they will continue to relax. I'm wondering when, for example, the mask wearing guidance from the CDC might be rolled back. We will wait for that to occur. We're not going to do anything that the CDC has not authorized officially. I don't have a crystal ball any better than all of you as to when that might ultimately happen. But we would expect, as vaccination rates continue to rise, that at some point in time that restriction might be implemented. And when and if that occurs, we would try to get that information out to you and to parks as soon as possible so you could react. In regards to where to go for information, Max has mentioned that this was something that you were particularly concerned about. I do understand that it's very difficult to try to gather all the information on where this guidance is. We have an external website that's available to the public, and we would strongly advise that all of you go to that website to gather information. And that website, and I'll pass the information back to Catherine and to Max to make sure that you have it if you don't already. But it's www.nps.gov/subjects/concessions. And if you put that in there, you'll get to our main landing page for the commercial services program overall. And on that page, in large letters, there's a big link that says public health information. And if you click that, it will bring you to a page that provides all of the information that we've prepared, the most current information on mask wearing, social distancing, all the things that you might need to encounter. And there are specific guidance on transportation systems in general and road-based commercial tours in particular. So again, you go to the commercial services starting page, and there's a big letters that says public health information. You just click that and you'll be taken to the page that has a whole list of this guidance that's applicable to commercial operators and partners, to include transportation in particular. So we try to keep that up as soon as any new information comes up. A lot of the information is targeted initially to parks and superintendents. And one of my jobs is to make sure that that is then taken and put into a format that can be uploaded to our website so that information is current for you as well as the superintendents. So that's where you're going to find the general information around what we're doing. For road-based commercial tour CUA programs, on that same landing page, if you were to scroll down further, there's a link to commercial use authorizations. And if you hit that page, you can then move from to our CUA page. And on that page, there's a specific link for road-based commercial tours, which provides any information relative to road-based commercial tours that you might be interested in. So I've mentioned that there's this patchwork set of requirements for parks. And the same is true for CUA requirements, not only COVID, but any other CUA requirements. And we know that it's very difficult for you to find that information. The one thing that we have done is that if you go to that road-based commercial tour page, there's actually a link to a table that's downloadable. That is a file that has every single park that currently has a road-based commercial tour program, and a hot link to the CUA program for that particular park. And so if you get to that page and download that file, you can select any one of the parks that you're planning to travel to, and that will give you the CUA requirements for that particular park. Now, it's a small number of parks because we only have road-based commercial tour programs for a small number of parks, and I'll talk about that in a second. There is no way for us to comprehensively have a landing page that would have all the CUA programs for all parks. Even with the small set that currently have it, there's still 25 or so. And CUA requirements are very specific to every park in terms of where parking is required, the specific requirements of that park. So it's challenging. We recognize to have to go and drive to that level of detail to find all of those requirements, but that is the nature of the program that we currently have. So hopefully that helps. So information sources, the commercial services landing page, and again, I'll share that landing page information with Catherine and Max so that you have it. And under there, there's a spot that links you directly to public health information for concessionaires and other partners, including road-based commercial tour operators. And then a separate page that addresses CUAs, and within there, there's a road-based commercial tour program for which there's a link to every single one of the CUA programs with individual park programs. So I'm going to move on, and there were some questions about group size and limitations, and what's happening with that within parks. Specifically, I think one of you had a question about trying to get reservations or bring a group in at Mount Rushmore National Park. So again, I don't have a lot of information on specifically what's going on from park to park. And to gather that information, the best thing to do would be to go to the park and ask that specific information. But as I mentioned at the start of the discussion, we are having issues associated with staffing, both for park staff as well as concession staff. And in many cases, there may be limitations that concessionaires are making short-term because they can't handle the volume that they're seeing, including the ability to handle groups. And I would expect that in the case of Mount Rushmore, that was likely the situation. And that may change. The likelihood for this coming summer, though, is that most of the staffing has already occurred. Many of our concessionaires are rigorously beating the bushes to try to get more people on. But you may have heard from news articles or otherwise that it's been difficult to get people to come back sometimes. And so they're providing incentive programs and other things to try to open up so that all their facilities are fully staffed. But the likelihood of that happening this summer is going to be low. And therefore, we're probably going to see some of these slowdowns and difficulties in being able to be everywhere we want to be until that resolves itself. We would anticipate that sort of thing will resolve itself by next year and that this should no longer be a problem that way. So there was a question about CUAs and where are they fundamentally required, particularly road-based commercial tour CUAs. So for those of you that have been working with the Park Service for a number of years, you know that there was an exercise several years ago to work on a centralized Washington-based road-based commercial tour standard CUA, or commercial use authorization. That made sense for us because statutorily we're supposed to have a CUA for everybody that comes into a park. There's a requirement in both statute and regulation that says that's supposed to happen. But it was very difficult and challenging to kind of figure out. And ultimately, we were asked to kind of put that exercise on hold in, I think it was probably February of 2020, maybe, and wait that out as COVID was occurring. And we knew that there was going to be a lot of challenges and we didn't need to overlay trying to introduce no program at that point in time. I have no information on when we might reinstitute that exercise. If and when we do, we'll be engaging very closely with the coalition that's been formed around COVID, as well as all of the folks that we had started to work with in putting together the previous program. But I don't really have any timing on that. So in the meantime, we have approximately 25 or so parks that were grandfathered in that already had a road-based commercial tour CUA program. Those were allowed to continue to operate. And that's that list that I mentioned on your road-based commercial tour CUA website that you could go to find out the specific requirements. And those are going to be the ones that have CUA programs for the time being until that pause is lifted. And we consider any other, any program for, say, a national program, which again, we don't have any plans for doing that in the immediate term. So there were some questions on reservation systems and time to entry. And I want to be clear in saying I don't know very much about this. The reservation system timed entry is part of a fee program and implemented by specific parks and not really part of my portfolio. So what I hear is mostly anecdotal, and you may have as much knowledge about how that program's working or not working as I do. My only real experience is that my son tried to get into Rocky Mountain National Park and didn't get the permit and didn't get there before 8 o'clock and therefore couldn't get into Rocky. There are programs that do have existing reservation systems that are limiting the number of people and there's a limited number of reservations that are occurring. In most of those, there's a requirement above and beyond the annual, the pass to get into the park to pay for that reservation. I think at a place like Glacier, it's $2 added on to the pass. I think other places are, Rocky, I mentioned, Yosemite. I think Zion did have a reservation system. I'm not sure exactly what's going to happen there. They just had a flood and I'm not sure if they're still going to continue that. Acadia National Park has a permanent program that they implemented through a public process where they gathered input and ultimately implemented that. So that will continue. These other permitting processes are really designed primarily to address the concerns about crowding in national parks in the period of COVID and post-COVID. Certainly many of our parks have a lot of crowding issues, and it may be that some of what's happening now will become information that will inform longer term programs, but I don't have any specific information on what that will look like. And a lot of it is kind of in progress right now, kind of learning as we go as we implement these programs. So again, how long these particular programs will be in place, they were really instituted for the purposes of COVID and to address the specific needs around that. How that ultimately plays out, I don't know. Whether it would be part of public comment processes, et cetera, I'm not sure. We do recognize that there are challenges associated with these processes. I've recognized those, some of those have already been vocalized, the Park Service leadership. I think I saw them again in your comments, and I may have some questions on this. Things like, how long in advance will this reservation program be in place so that we can make sure that we can get reservations and guarantee the tour that we're offering for places like the UK and the EU that have stringent requirements around that, or simply even if it's domestically, to be able to guarantee that you're going to be able to address the itinerary that you wanted to. We understand those issues. I don't have any answers to those now, and I think taking that sort of feedback back so that if and when these programs kind of evolve over time, we'll be able to address them appropriately. But I don't have any specific answers on those. The last kind of key question that I received was a kind of a detailed questions about distinctions between school groups and how that was managed. And Samantha Towery, who is our commercial use program manager, would probably be better suited to address the specifics on this if you have particular questions. So if I don't answer it well enough, we can make sure that we get questions back to us and then provide them to you directly through Samantha. But as I understand it, we've got school groups could come in different ways to the park. Often we get school groups that are coming without any guide. It's the teacher and they're running on the school bus that was the local school bus. Those do not require a CUA because they're not a commercial activity. They're exempted as a nonprofit educational activity. And their fees are waived through the fee program that the Park Service has to come into the park. The distinction is those that are hiring a tour company or a tour guide, and they're coming in on a tour. And I will read this so that I get it right. Whoever is operating the tour needs a CUA. And I will say that this is for those parks that have a road-based commercial tour program, which there are a limited number. So if the tour company has a guide on board, one or the other needs it. So it's either the tour company or the guide. If the tour company puts together the trip but doesn't have a guide on board and the bus company is the one providing the tour, basically supplying the vehicle in the park, then they need that, the CUA. And this is allowing us to kind of manage the variety of operations that are coming or configurations that are coming to parks. But ultimately, our interest there is that somebody coming into the park has a CUA and understands the permit conditions associated with it, so we can help manage that experience when they come into the park. So that's kind of my summary based on some of the questions that I had received, kind of overall where we think the Park Service is going in terms of moving from 20 to 22 and all the associated limitations that have occurred and are kind of slowly moving, what some of those limitations are right now, and where you can go for information on those as they evolve over time. And then a couple of specific questions about where we might be with the CUA program generally, and questions about specific types of CUAs, such as those that might be bringing school groups. So those were the topics that I saw, and I am happy to entertain any questions that anybody might have, Catherine, if I can answer them. And if not, we'll take those questions back.
Excellent, Kurt, thank you so much. I think you did a wonderful job at not only sharing very helpful information, but also helping us, better understand, the challenges that you do have sometimes in answering the questions. And so it helps to have that understanding. I think we have about 4 questions that have come in. I'm going to look first to the Q&A. And we have a question about, I have travel writers coming to visit and am having a difficult time getting tours for them. What can I do to help them have the best experience possible? And if you feel like you need additional information, I can ask Dawn to unmute Kate's microphone if you need additional information on that.
Yeah, that might be great. And maybe while that's happening, I can say generally, yeah, we know that there are going to be limitations. I've had experiences where I've gotten a lot of comments about difficulty with getting service, particularly in restaurants. Or there may be situations such as the one that was referenced at Mount Rushmore, where Mount Rushmore wasn't taking groups, and difficult to negotiate those kinds of situations where they're kind of landmark locations and you really want the visitors to have a good experience. The only thing I can really offer is, and it's something that I know you are all working really hard on, is to look at the broad plethora of possible experiences and see if there are places that you may be able to use as an alternate. And I don't think this is all going to be permanent. This is, you're dealing with some stuff this summer that likely is not going to be there next summer. And so, if it's not Mount Rushmore, maybe it's Custer State Park or Wind Cave or other places where they can have a great experience. It's obviously not Mount Rushmore, I get it, but maybe there's a way to make those sorts of adjustments, given the fact that we can't, unfortunately, address the fact that they just understaffed and they can't provide the services. And I'm happy to get any further clarification.
Yeah, and Kate, I think you said you don't have a microphone, so we'll see if she maybe can type some things in, but I think that was helpful. But yeah, Kate, so if you want to type in any additional information, I'll pick that back up. Another question was, are NPS volunteers back working in the parks?
Yes, they are subject to the same sorts of restrictions. We kind of treat our volunteers in parks as park employees. So they're subject to limitations in terms of their living space. So we do have limitations if they were sharing living quarters. A lot of volunteers in parks that come in are elderly and they bring their RV in, but they are there. And I think, many of them are coming back in quickly because they didn't get an opportunity last year. But we're still, again, limited. So many of the things kind of flow back to things like housing, or, do we have all the wastewater treatment systems operating? Some of the infrastructure that may be limited by our core staff not being available. And so we do have some of those limitations that could limit our ability to open areas or bring in the volunteers as we so like to do. But yeah, they should be out there, I hope.
Great, thank you. Another question. So someone was looking for the road-based commercial tours CUAs, and they wanted to know if there's a similar form for transportation CUAs, and maybe you can explain that situation.
Yeah, I will. Again, I wish Sam were on the call because she would do a great job at this. But yeah, so we do have just transportation companies that aren't providing a tour and they're coming through the park, and there's a separate transportation CUA form and program. Again, those are all driven directly back to that CUA page at the park. So I can provide some more information that Max and you can share with that individual and in your entire group about the differences between the two, because it is subtle and complicated, as well as the differences between the forms and where to go for them. I'm happy to do that.
Great, thank you. So this is a little longer. So regarding CUAs, we are a tour operator that contracts with local motor coach companies for transportation. So far, the only park we visit this year that will require a CUA for both the coach company and us as a tour operator is Grand Canyon, which is different from what I've always understood should happen. So using the links that are just provided, going to Arches National Park CUA page, for example, it reads like the tour operator needs the road-based commercial tour CUA in addition to the motor coach company. However, I received a call back from the CUA agent responding to Arches and Canyonlands, and she told me we, as the tour operator, do not need the CUA at least for 2021. And she says, we do have a tour manager on board the coach. And Kurt, that is something that I've heard. My understanding was that only one, either the motor coach company or the tour operator, needed to have it. And it needs to be industry who decides that that's not something that you all regulate, but there are some examples like this where some parks require both.
That's really good input, and I will take that back. My opinion is that we're looking for a CUA to make sure that the operation understands the rules and requirements of the park. The park has the ability to, gather some minimum fee in order to address the need to manage parking and other things. So I fundamentally need to double check on that, because I don't know why we would be asking for both. There may be something I'm missing, and so I don't want to say that it's an absolute, but that is where we were trying to get to ultimately was, we don't know how to manage that relationship, and we've had conversations about things like, well, who carries the insurance for the vehicle? How do we know if we're a tour operator and we're renting coaches, that coach has adequate insurance, and how do we manage that? To be frank, I think we said, we don't care how, we just need to make sure that the insurance is there. So if you can negotiate that with your motor coach operator, that would be preferred to doing a double dip where we would have to say, okay, if you've got these things separated, and that may be the case here, that the separation is because it was too difficult to get the relevant information from each of the parts of the tour. But I will take that back and ask those questions, both of Grand Canyon as well as my CUA program manager.
Great, thank you, because I see another related question. I'll go on and jump down to that they have been advised for several years now that Acadia, Arches, and Grand Canyon all require both the coach company and tour company to have the CUAs.
Yeah, and that maybe the transportation CUA versus the road-based commercial tour CUA. So I will again look into that and provide clarity, and make sure that is clearly understood. And if there is a reason for it, the reason why.
Great, thank you very much.
You bet.
So Kate has come back and said, what about fall? We're looking at, and I am not going to be able to pronounce CHIRICAHUA National Monument and the Coronado National Memorial.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not familiar with that first one. How is it spelled again?
If it's spelled correctly, CHIRICAHUA.
Chihuahua. Yeah, so well, we certainly hope, both of those are fairly small park units. And Coronado, I think, is, I'm not very familiar with them. So I would expect that, they ought to be operating. Neither of those have concession operations, so we don't have limitations in terms of the services that concessions might be providing. And I don't really know much about their staffing requirements, so certainly we would like to see that people would be able to get there in the fall. I'd be surprised if that were a problem. It might be great to get some more information specifically from Kate on what the concerns are, and maybe there's something I can do specifically in regards to those two parks, because I'd be surprised if there was an inability to go to those units in particular.
Thank you. And you did address this somewhat, but will the CUA applications be standardized? For example, the Grand Canyon requires a date and time stamp, and I haven't found any other park that requires that.
Yeah, this is part of the individual programs. We do have like a standard application process that we've shared with parks so that they can build off that, but they all have individual programs, and there may be a specific reason that Grand Canyon is determined that they need to have that date and time stamp as opposed to others. It's an interesting question, which I can also take back to the program. We don't have a national program overall where everything is being fed through a central system. So each park is managing it, and they will add to the kind of core what specific requirements they need, or maybe which may be specific application requirements as well as specific operating requirements. So I can't speak to specifically why they need it. And it may just be a function of at one point in time they thought that that was a good piece of information to have, and maybe a Glacier or a Yellowstone doesn't feel that there's a need for that information. I can certainly, again, ask that specific question as to why that's unique to that park and you haven't seen it elsewhere.
Thank you. So if we have multiple tours going through a park that requires a CUA at separate dates on hired motor coaches, do we need a separate CUA for each tour?
I think the answer to that is no. If you're the same company operating multiple buses over multiple days, that would be, you would, as I understand it, probably describe your intentions in terms of the amount of time you're going to be coming over the year, and that would be documented. And so you would not need multiple CUAs for multiple dates for the same kind of package coming through just multiple times.
Gotcha. And I'm looking in the chat now. Let's see, the CDC Mask Requirement addresses public transportation where the passenger's vaccination status is unknown. Will NPS encourage the CDC to relax its mask requirements for motor coach groups in which every participant is known to be vaccinated?
That's a really good question. I think that the Park Service will ultimately defer to how the CDC manages that. So I think that that's a nuanced piece, and well described. If we were to see, for example, airlines to take that approach, because we could assume the same thing, we might see that. I think the Park Service is still a little challenged in knowing, and I could understand that perhaps there could be some reliance upon you to be able to check vaccination status for everybody. And so I guess it is possible in that environment that we might be able to say, okay, we know everybody is vaccinated, and so the entire bus doesn't need to wear a mask. So it's something to consider. I'll take that information back to the team to see if we'd be interested in kind of considering that. And it does provide some risk to you as a tour operator to collect vaccination status and validate that. And if something untoward happens, unfortunately, there'd be some, it'd be unfortunate if that were to occur. So we don't see that right now. I think so far we've kind of dialed it in and said, we're going to use this for all transportation systems. And of course, there's a difference between a bus tour that's short-term, where it's coming in for one day, a long-term bus tour that's coming on a multi-day tour, and then the shuttle services that we've had in it. So, certainly we can't do that on a shuttle because we wouldn't be able to ask everybody getting on, show their card. In fact, we're not allowed to do that. The federal government, you've probably seen this concept of a vaccination passport is one that is somewhat contentious. And so at this point in time, the federal government isn't doing that. Individual operators can do that. So you have some leeway that we don't have. So I'll take that question back as we look at trying to continue to move the needle back towards normalcy. This may be an opportunity for us to do something. I can't guarantee that, though, that decision would be made kind of a couple levels above me and informed by our public health folks.
Thank you.
A good question and clarification.
And there is just one last question. And, she said, I know that you don't have information on specific parks. Who might be the best contact? And this may have been one of the URLs that you shared earlier, but is there an nps.gov page that you could direct us to?
Yeah, so I will share that with you immediately
Great.
following. Again, it's pretty easy to navigate to. If you get to our main commercial services page, or if you're familiar with the CUA page, there's a section on road-based commercial tour. You hit that, and then there's a narrative that says, if you want requirements about specific parks, click here. You click that, and it opens up. I know it's a lot of clicks, but it opens up a page with all the parks that have CUA programs and a hot link to their direct website page with that information. Now, we have strongly encouraged, and I don't have command and control over park superintendents. They are onto themselves, but we have strongly encouraged that they be clear and concise in the information that they provide on their CUA page, so that somebody could go there quickly, get the information that's needed, see where the application form is very quickly without having to fuss around trying to find it or make phone calls to get that. Now, we're probably, successful in some and not so in others, and we apologize for that. We will continue to encourage superintendents as part of their training to, be clear about this, because it is impactful, and we understand that.
Great. Kurt, thank you so much. And I think we're getting toward the hour, and I don't see any other questions. So I want to thank you so much for being with us today. A lot of really, really great information. And, we want to help be a resource and a solution. And I know our coalition has said that. So, look to us at any time for information, without a doubt.
Yes. Well, I will say you have a lot of challenging topics to deal with. We understand that. And we appreciate the opportunity to have ongoing dialogue. I know that that's occurring at my level as well as levels above me. And we look forward to continuing that. And if there's silver linings in COVID, one of them is the ongoing kind of collaboration that has occurred with a lot of our partners, much more robust. I mean, we had a pretty good thing going beforehand, but I think even more so now. And we want to keep that moving, because ultimately that helps us understand your needs, and you understand our where we're coming from. So it's really been very helpful for us. So thank you for inviting me to this call. I really appreciate it.
Oh, well, absolutely. Thank you for being here. And I want to thank all of our members so much for being here. Fantastic questions. And please continue to reach out and let me know of your ideas, your concerns and comments and questions, and we'll pass those on to Kurt and others at NPS so we can get answers for you. And I would not be a great idea for me to close off without saying I look forward to seeing everyone at Travel Exchange in person in Cleveland, November 14 through 17. And Kurt, you're more than welcome to join us there. In fact, we're going to have a National Parks Pavilion, if you haven't heard, and we're excited about that. And Sue Cronin, I think you're on. If you want to put your contact information in the chat for anyone who would like to learn more, or you can reach out to us and we'll put you in contact with Sue. But we're just excited about Travel Exchange. Kurt, thank you once again. And to our members, happy Canada Day and happy 4th of July coming up. So Kurt, thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Have a great day.
Thanks, you too.